Hope everyone is doing great today. I would like to discuss my thoughts or feelings about the movie Iron Claw. And I have kind of a unique perspective as to uh, a lot of people out there, and that's because growing up, my brother had actually went to work for the Von Erichs, for Fritz Von Erich. And my mother was a very poor lady. She had had a stroke when she was 45, and we were very, very poor when we were growing up as kids. And one day, my brother comes to me and says, Fritz would like for you to go and meet Chris Von Erich and hang around with Chris for a while. Their real name was Atkinson. And hang around him because he's concerned because him and Mike were the closest of close. They were not only brothers, but they was best friends. And so Fritz had a big place. This was outside of Tyler. And he was, I'll never forget it. I knock on the door, and this great, big, huge man opens up the door, and his legs were massive, and he was wearing underwear, and it was Fritz Von Erich. And at the time, my mother was a huge fan of wrestling. She believed that wrestling was 100% legitimate. It was real. You couldn't tell the woman any different. She really believed that it was a real deal. And so I knocked on the door. Like I said, Fritz came to the door. And if any of the Von Erichs ever see this, they'll know that I'm telling the truth about what I'm talking about. And so he calls Chris. Chris comes. Meets me. We go upstairs. They had a apartment built above the carport of this house. It was a full-blown apartment, and that's where Chris lived at. Chris was a pretty cool guy. He was very short, little chunky. He would always talk about wrestling and how he wanted to be a wrestler, but because the asthma medicine had stunted his growth, he didn't know if he would ever be able to be one. And that he felt that, his fans constantly talked to him and wanted him to become a wrestler. And I didn't really think, to be honest with you, that he'd have any fans. I didn't think anybody would really know by looking at Chris, that they would even picture that was an actual Von Erich. So we go out. I had my nicest clothes on. Like I said, we were poor as could be, and I had my nicest clothes on. And we go get on some three-wheelers, and we were driving around the mountainside. And the land that they had, Battle Creek that we've heard about, in school, was in this location. And we would go out and like I said, ride the three-wheeler and look at stuff. And I knew that Chris loved his brother, but I never really realized how much that Chris really loved his brother until, that day on the deal. And well, first of all, I was concerned that I was going to destroy my clothes or mess up my clothes. And Chris is like, oh, don't worry about it. We'll get you some more. And so we're driving around, and we go up to the top of a hill, and it was one of the most beautiful places I've ever literally seen in my life. It was an old Indian, I don't know what you'd call it. It wasn't a burial ground, but it was like a worship area that they would pray in or do their thing in. And it had these special rocks that would glow when the sun hit them. And you'd be up there, and he had a teepee, and there was some like little huts type things that you could actually kind of go in. They didn't go all the way to the top, but they were around the sides. And I mean, it was the most beautiful thing. And I remember we're setting up there, and Chris, it hadn't been that long since he lost Mike, and he was really torn up, and he made a remark that he was looking for a sign from Mike to tell him to go with Mike, and I'll never forget it. His words were, that, and it could be as simple as a bird in the right direction looking at him or whatever. Chris was. He was very, very talented. He, inside of his little apartment, and eventually they moved into a trailer house and that he had out on the land. And Chris was very talented. He had went through and he had collected uh, arrows throughout the property that they owned. He had them all saved in bookshelves, all in his apartment. I mean, he had, it seemed like hundreds of them. Of course, I was still a young man back when this all happened, before he even started working out or trying to get into wrestling. And he drew a lot of pictures, but he didn't draw the pictures. He used dots, and so different pressure he would apply with different levels. And I mean, he was a true artist, and he wanted to get into archaeology. That's the thing that he really uh, thought about, fascinated. He really thought about, and really believed that that would be the right career path for him. Um, he he didn't get into trouble. He wasn't a smart ass. He was a very nice young man, and we became best friends for quite a while. Over time, he got to where he was started working out with Carrie. From my understanding, he was taking some stuff to help him grow higher in length. Make the bones grow a little bit longer in length, because he was so short when I met him. But Chris was a fascinating person, and the part of the movie that bothered me is why they did not put Chris in that movie. I know that it was very, in order to fit it within the time frame of the movie, but Chris was a very dynamic part of the real life home deal that was there. And like I said, him and Mike were best friends. I mean, that's all he wanted to do was hang around with Mike, and it was really a fascinating love that he had and respect that he had for his brother. Um, I remember we were sitting in the apartment one day, and being as small as Chris was, he was a tough little guy. And I remember Kevin coming up there, and Kevin, great big guy. The guy didn't wear shoes. I mean, it wasn't just the ring; he just didn't wear shoes. And I was kind of the same way, but he wouldn't wear shoes. And I remember that Kevin came in and he sat down on a sofa, and Chris had a pair of deer antlers on the sofa, and Kevin started moving those deer antlers, and it pissed Chris off, and Chris told him to stop it, dumbass. But I'll never forget that, his brother Kevin sitting there. That guy was a phenomenal in shape. I mean, he was massive, and it kind of seemed like he really didn't have a care in the world. Um, but let's talk a little bit about Fritz, because in that movie, Fritz looks like the most evil person on the planet. And the reality of it is maybe Fritz was, to his kids and to his family and to his employees and all that kind of stuff. But that wasn't all of Fritz. Fritz was actually a very nice man, one of the nicest men that I'd run across. And I don't know if his kids know this, or if Kevin knows this, or his grandkids know this, but he would help people, and he didn't want to be recognized. He didn't want people to know that he helped them. And I remember all of a sudden my brother was bringing money home, and this was, again, many years ago, and it was like, I think, a couple $100. And this money was coming from Fritz. Fritz would give my brother this money to give to my mother, because we, at that time, I think we were living on $365 a month, and that helped my mother out a lot. Of course, Charles, my brother, wasn't supposed to say anything, but of course he did. My mom's favorite wrestler at the time was Maniac Matt Bourne, which I believe became the Clown in WWE at the time, but when he was Matt Brown, he worked for Fritz at the Cotton Bowl there, and I remember that he would bring her pictures or he'd give my brother pictures to give to her, signatures of all the wrestlers and stuff like that. And one of the cooler things that happened was, and again, Fritz did not want any recognition for any of this, but I believe that, from my understanding, when Mikey committed suicide, de-lifed himself, that he was in a trailer house, and that trailer house was given to me and my mom from Fritz. And you're talking about people, again, that didn't have any money, and that house meant the world to my mom. It wasn't a really big fancy trailer or nothing like that. I mean, it was a simple mobile home, but it was the first place that she had that she could call hers, and she didn't have to worry about somebody taking it away. And Fritz, not only did he give it to her, but he paid to have it moved and set up for her. And again, an older woman like my mother was, who had never owned anything in her life, that meant the world to her. Fritz had some tanks that he had built on his property, and uh, from my understanding, nobody fished in Fritz's place. And he had a pond that had a bunch of like minnows and smaller fish, and then he had a pond that was completely stocked full of catfish. And he would tell my brother to go get my mom and take her out there and go fishing. So my mom would go out and fish. And I mean, there was no fishing to it. As soon as you put a hook in the water, you had, a good 4 or 5 pound catfish. And it didn't matter what you put on it. It was set up. But Fritz was a very nice to us. And I think that in this world, it's very important. Most of us have more sides than just one. Most of us do have a good side, and Fritz definitely had a good side when it came to others. He didn't have to do those things for us, but he did. Then a few years later, him and Doris had split up, I believe, after Kerry had left himself, and that happened on the ranch, not like at the movies where it happened in Dallas. It happened out at Tyler, and Doris and Fritz split up. Fritz ended up he lived in a little wood frame house, nothing fancy. We're talking, it was probably built in the 60s, 70s, wood siding on it. But I'll never forget, he had all of this equipment like dozers and backhoes and stuff on there. And we're sitting there talking to Fritz and, asking him how he's doing. He's bragging. He's like, he's got this movie that he thinks is going to come out. It's going to tell the story of his family. He was really excited about that. And then I remember him making a remark about how, he had all this heavy equipment. He didn't know why Kevin didn't come down and operate it. He could make a bunch of money operating this heavy equipment. But, Fritz was, you got to think about it. I mean, this is a man that had accomplished so much in life. He went from a very poor individual who would go around and paint your house address on the side of curbs and do beauty contests for kids. I mean, they were poor, and the man worked hard to accomplish the things that he did. From my understanding, the way he came up with the Iron Claw is he was in the car. Some guy was in front of him. The guy in front of him, there was road rage. He gets out and he's going to go and whip up on Fritz. And Fritz gets out and he's got his suit on, and he put his arm out and put his hand on the guy's forehead, and that's how he came up with the claw. And that's what we were told by Fritz. But who knows if that's really the case or not. But in those days, I mean, it sounds very reasonable because, like I said, the man didn't have anything. He got into the wrestling. He owned apartment communities in the DFW area. I mean, he wanted to do right. He wanted to do good, but it was the house that they had built was incredible outside of Tyler. It was a big, beautiful home. It was unbelievable. He had all these ponds and stuff built around it. Like I said, this house had a walk-in. It had a grocery store basically inside this house. I mean, you talk about people prepping and stuff like that. No, you would go into one of the rooms and it had shelves lined in it, and those shelves had all the different foods that they would eat, and all stacked up nice and neat like you would see at a grocery store. They had refrigerators and freezers with big old glass doors. I mean, when the boys came down, they would eat, from what they told us, a pound of bacon and a dozen eggs, like for breakfast. I mean, so they stocked a lot of food in this house, which they needed to because they were probably a good 30 minutes outside of Tyler, Texas. But when they split up, from my understanding, the home was sold to one of the top people at I can't remember the name of it now, Better Homes and Gardens. And they lived in, I mean, they designed this house. It started out smaller, and of course it grew bigger and bigger, but they had the money. They didn't have to worry about stuff like that. A funny story I remember is Fritz had this Saint Bernard, and he loved the Saint Bernard. And you'd see big old Fritz. He had a Jeep out on the property, and he would go out there, and the Saint Bernard, he wanted to go with him, and he wanted to go to the Saint Bernard, but Saint Bernard couldn't get in the back of the Jeep, and so Fritz would lean over. The dog would put his paws up on the front, and Fritz would pick him up and put him in the back of the Jeep, and they would go on about their deal. Well, they also had a chocolate lab, and every time you turn around, this chocolate lab, which again, from my understanding, was given to Fritz. It was very highly blood line chocolate lab, and it was given to Fritz. Well, Fritz got to where he hated that dog, because every time he'd turn around, that dog would take his Saint Bernard out and get Saint Bernard lost, and he would come home, and then it would be a while later before the Saint Bernard came home, and Fritz hated that dog, so he ended up giving that dog to me. So I had the dog. I kept it for a long time. She was a sweet, beautiful chocolate lab. But it was just funny, sitting back and knowing them and seeing that, and those people. All the ones I met were as down to earth as anybody you ever seen. I mean, they didn't go putting a front out there. They talked to you just like I'm talking to you guys. But I'll never forget that, and never forget the things that I saw, on that ranch, as far as the beauty and the talent that Chris had, and the thoughts and the drives that he had. I mean, could you imagine being born into this world? And you've got all these brothers that are big and tall and super athletic, and you're 5 foot nothing, little chubby. You have asthma. You're not athletic because you can't be, and you kind of feel like the black sheep of the family. And in those days, the Von Erichs. I mean, when I talk about popular, those guys were popular in the DFW area. Everybody knew who they was. They couldn't go anywhere without getting, stopped to sign autographs and to stop to do, in those days they didn't have selfies, but those guys were, and they treated everybody nice. I mean, they would stop and they would sign them and all that. But I mean, it's crazy to think that people knew who Chris was, but I actually seen it in real life, where we go to a little station and the person inside the store recognized him, and it went from there. And Chris wasn't on TV. I mean, he had been in a couple of little deals where he helped his brothers in the ring or whatever, but he wasn't in wrestling at that time. He hadn't even started working at that time, but people recognized who he was, and so he felt like he couldn't really go out in public and do things, but yet he also did not have the same gifts that his brothers had, and it really affected him. He had fans, is the way that he saw it and he believed, and his fans expected for him to become a wrestler, and they pushed for him to become a wrestler, and in his mind, he had to become a wrestler. And but the reality of it is that he didn't have the height, he didn't have the size, and because of the steroids and stuff that he had taken, it had affected his bones. And when I'm talking about steroids, I'm talking about from his asthma treatments. But they were great guys. I'll never forget them. In the mobile home that we got from Fritz, it was pretty crazy. I had the discus that Kerry had broken national championships with. I've still got it somewhere. We had the ring jackets. We had one of Kerry's ring jackets with the roses on it. I had Kevin's ring jackets. I mean, I still got a lot of that stuff. We had pictures of when they played basketball, personal stuff. I mean, it was amazing that Fritz was the top person that he was, that was able to look at that and give it to somebody that it meant the world to. And at the end of the day, that's what we should all be doing. We should all be looking at things that we can do to help others, and things that we can do to it's not just about us and just not about the value of that item, but it's also got to be about the people and how you can help people. So for me personally, and for my brother who worked for Fritz for probably 10 years, they were great. I mean, they were as good as you could ask for. and I appreciate them to this day. I remember once when Mike had injured his shoulder, he had been out with the toxic shock syndrome. They had a big deal at the Cotton Bowl where it was going to be, he was out of the hospital and Fritz was doing refereeing a match, and I remember them driving in on the car and Mike waving to everybody, and I thought that was great. But then on the way to the ring, Fritz had given us tickets to the Cotton Bowl to watch them, and Fritz comes down the deal to be the special referee, and he sees my mom, which he knew where she was, and he stops over and gives my mom a kiss on the cheek. Oh my God. My mom thought that was the greatest thing ever. I didn't know she was ever going to wash her cheek again, but that just kind of goes to show you what kind of a man he was. I mean, he was just a great man. He cared. He didn't have to do that. But to my mother, that was a day that, she never forgot as long as she was with us. And I'll never forget it. I know my brother will never forget it. So, Fritz worked hard, and his family, all the boys worked hard. They lived their dream. I want you all to live your dream. And thank you all for listening to this. I know this is kind of long, but if you got any questions, please feel free, drop them in the comments. If you would, comment, share. I'm trying to build this channel, and it's going to be about a lot of different things. It's going to be, DIY, maintenance type stuff. It's also going to be about stories like this and just different things that I think might be, entertaining for all of you. There's going to be some stuff on prepping as well. So please like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, and thank you all.